The helicopter dropped me at the outpost just as the last bit of weak daylight faded from the horizon. I stepped onto the packed snow, my breath crystallizing instantly in the brutal cold. The pilot hadn't spoken more than 10 words during our 4-hour flight, and I didn't expect a goodbye. Sure enough, the moment my boots hit the ground and I grabbed my duffel, the rotors spun faster and the craft lifted away, vanishing into the darkening sky within minutes. Alaska's northern reaches in January. -50 degrees. I'd volunteered for this assignment thinking it would be good career advancement. 6 months at a remote monitoring station, keeping watch over Russian naval movements or whatever classified operation the brass had cooking. Now, staring at the squat, gray building partially buried in snowdrifts, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. A figure emerged from the main entrance, hunched against the cold despite wearing what looked like 3 layers of Arctic gear. He moved with purpose, his face obscured by a thermal mask and hood. "Patterson!" he called over the wind. "Yes, sir," I answered, shouldering my bag. "Get inside. Now." I followed him across the 30 yards of exposed ground between us and the building, feeling the cold cut through my supposedly state-of-the-art cold weather gear like it was made of tissue paper. The door opened to a small airlock-style entry chamber. The outer door closed behind us with a heavy metallic clunk before the inner door was unlocked. The man pulled down his hood and mask, revealing a weathered face with deep lines around his eyes and cropped silver-gray hair. "Thomas Carter, commanding officer," he said, offering no handshake. "You're replacing Erickson. I assume you weren't told why he left." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "No, sir. Just told there was an immediate opening." Carter nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Follow me." The interior of the outpost was utilitarian but surprisingly warm after the bitter cold outside. Narrow hallways connected a series of small rooms. We passed what looked like a mess hall with 3 men seated around a table playing cards. They glanced up as we walked by, their expressions blank. Carter led me to a small office containing only a metal desk and 2 chairs. After closing the door, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a laminated sheet of paper. He placed it on the desk and slid it toward me. "These are the rules," he said. "Memorize them. Follow them without exception." I picked up the sheet and read, 1. Never go outside between 0200 and 0500 hours. 2. Do not look out any window during those same hours. 3. If power fails, remain where you are until it returns. Do not move. 4. A bowl of blood must be placed outside the north exit at 0200 hours exactly every night. 5. Never open any door without the correct call and response. The wind is rising, but we will stand. 6. Ignore any unrecognized voices on the radio. I looked up at Carter, waiting for him to crack a smile, tell me this was some kind of initiation prank for the new guy. His face remained impassive, eyes serious. "Is this a joke, sir?" I asked. "Did I say anything about joking, Patterson?" "No, sir, but a bowl of blood? Not looking out windows? This seems like whatever you want it to seem like." He cut me off. "But I don't give a damn what you think about these rules. I care that you follow them. Every soldier who's broken them has either disappeared or worse." I stared at the list again. "Worse than disappearing, sir?" Carter stood up. "You'll meet your team now. 5 of us total, including you. We operate this outpost on 6-month rotations. Your predecessor broke rule number 2 3 weeks ago. He's no longer with us." My mouth went dry. Did he request transfer? Let's say that. Carter's tone made it clear the subject was closed. We walked to the mess hall where the 3 men had stopped their card game and were now standing at attention. None of them looked happy to see me. "Patterson, this is your team. Robert Hayes, senior analyst." A tall, lean man with dark hair going gray at the temples nodded curtly. "Travis Coleman, communications." A stocky guy with blonde stubble covering his jaw gave me a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. And Jerry Mitchell, our youngest, equipment specialist. The skinny kid with darting pale eyes barely looked at me before fixing his gaze on the floor. "Men, this is David Patterson, your new security specialist. He'll be taking the night watch rotation with Hayes starting tomorrow." The 3 of them mumbled unenthusiastic greetings. "Hayes, show Patterson his quarters and the facility layout. I expect you all at 2000 hours for shift change briefing." Carter left the room, and the atmosphere immediately shifted. Travis's shoulders relaxed slightly, while Jerry checked his watch in what seemed like a nervous habit. "So you're the replacement," Hayes said, his voice flat. "Grab your gear. Quarters are this way." I followed him down another corridor, noting the surprising size of the facility. Much of it seemed to be underground. "How long have you been here?" I asked, trying to break the ice. 4 months this rotation," Hayes replied. "Second tour at this location. You requested to come back?" He gave me a sidelong look. "Nobody requests this place, Patterson. I was ordered back because I know the protocols." We reached a small room with a bunk, locker, and desk. "Home sweet home," Hayes said without humor. "Bathrooms 2 doors down, shared with Coleman. Chow schedules on the board in the mess. Night shift is 2000 to 0800. You'll mostly monitor surveillance equipment." I set down my bag on the thin mattress. "So about those rules?" "Follow them," Hayes interrupted. "That's all you need to know." "But the bowl of blood, where does that even come from?" Hayes looked at me for a long moment, like he was deciding how much to say. "Medical supplies. We maintain a blood bank for the requirement. Carter will show you the procedure. And what happens if it's not put outside? Don't miss a night and you won't have to find out." Hayes pointed to my wrist. "Your watch synchronized to Arctic Standard Time?" I nodded. "Keep it that way. Time matters here, especially between 0200 and 0500. After Hayes left, I unpacked my meager belongings and tried to process what was happening. The rules seemed absurd, but the men's reactions to them were deadly serious. I decided to explore the facility before the scheduled briefing. The outpost was larger than I expected, with several monitoring stations, living quarters, a small medical bay, storage areas, and what appeared to be a reinforced safe room. As I walked the corridors, I studied the construction. The windows were small, reinforced with what looked like ballistic glass, and fitted with thick metal shutters that could be closed from the inside. I made my way toward what I assumed was the north side of the building, looking for the exit mentioned in the rules. I found it at the end of a short corridor, a heavy steel door with multiple locking mechanisms. What caught my eye weren't the locks, though. It was the door frame. Deep gouges scarred the steel around the frame, like something with immense strength had tried to claw its way inside. The marks didn't look like they'd been made by any tool I recognized. They were jagged, irregular, and disturbingly wide set. I ran my fingers over the gouges, feeling their depth. "Don't do that." I turned to find Jerry standing behind me, his eyes nervously shifting between my face and the damaged doorframe. "What made these?" I asked. Jerry checked his watch again, a reflexive motion. "We don't talk about that." "How long have you been here, Jerry?" 3 months, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Longest 3 months of my life." "And you've seen what made these marks?" His eyes widened. "No, no one sees it and stays the same." He started backing away. "Don't look for it, man. Just follow the rules." Before I could ask another question, he hurried off down the hallway, leaving me alone by the scarred door. At the 2000 hours briefing, Carter explained my duties in clinical detail. I would monitor surveillance equipment, maintain the perimeter sensors, and assist with daily maintenance tasks. He reviewed the rules again, emphasizing that they were not suggestions. When he mentioned the blood bowl ritual, I couldn't help but press for more information. "Sir, with respect, what exactly requires this offering?" The room went silent. Travis and Jerry exchanged glances while Hayes stared straight ahead, his expression unchanged. Carter studied me for a moment. "You're not cleared for that information, Patterson. You're cleared to follow the protocols that keep us alive." "But..." "Dismissed." Carter cut me off. "Hayes, Patterson starts night shift with you in 30 minutes. As we filed out of the room, I noticed how the other men moved, always aware of their surroundings, checking corners before turning them, staying away from the windows. They carried themselves like men in a war zone, not a monitoring station. "Hey," I said quietly to Travis as we walked back toward the living quarters. "How bad is it, really?" Travis glanced around before answering. "Follow the rules, man, especially the window thing. Erickson. He thought he saw his daughter out there one night. Pressed his face right up against the glass during the blackout hours." "What happened to him?" Travis looked away. "Nothing you want to happen to you." That night, as Hayes and I sat in the monitoring room watching blank screens, I tried again to get information. "So, we're monitoring for what exactly? Russian activity? Wildlife?" Hayes tapped a few keys on his console without looking at me. Both. Neither. Just watch your screens and tell me if you see movement. What kind of movement? Any kind. Hours passed in silence. The clock on the wall showed 01:45 when Hayes stood up and stretched. Time for the ritual, he said. You're coming with me. We walked to a small refrigerated room near the medical bay. Hayes punched a code into the lock and the door swung open, revealing shelves of blood bags, standard medical blood bags like you'd see in any hospital. Military ships this in with our regular supplies, Hayes explained, selecting a bag. Carter says it keeps the balance. Balance of what? I asked. Hayes didn't answer. He took the bag to a small preparation area where a metal bowl waited. It looked ancient, with strange markings etched around its rim. He carefully cut the bag and poured its contents into the bowl. Come on, he said, lifting the bowl carefully. It needs to be outside by 0200 exactly. We walked to the north exit, the one with the claw marks. Hayes handed me the bowl while he worked the series of locks. The blood was still cold from refrigeration, making the metal bowl feel like ice in my hands. When I open this, Hayes said quietly, you place the bowl exactly 10 paces from the door, then come straight back. Don't look around, don't hesitate. 10 paces out, straight back. Understood? I nodded, feeling my heart rate increase. What happens if I see something out there? You won't, if you're quick. It's not time yet. He checked his watch. Ready? 01:59. The locks disengaged with heavy mechanical sounds. Hayes pulled the door open, letting in a blast of Arctic air that took my breath away. The floodlights illuminated a small area of pristine snow. Beyond that, absolute darkness. Go, Hayes ordered. I stepped outside, the cold instantly biting through my uniform. I counted my paces, trying not to rush despite every instinct telling me to run. 1, 2, 3. The snow crunched under my boots. 4, 5, 6. The darkness beyond the floodlights seemed to press in. 7, 8, 9. Something about the quality of that darkness didn't feel right. 10. I set the bowl down carefully on the snow and turned back toward the door where Hayes waited. I walked steadily, fighting the urge to sprint. As I stepped back inside, Hayes immediately secured the locks. Good, he said, his voice tight. Now we go back to the monitoring room and we don't look at any screens showing the exterior until 0500. As we walked back, I noticed the other men had disappeared into their quarters. The hallways were empty and unusually quiet, as if the entire building was holding its breath. In the monitoring room, Hayes systematically turned off all exterior camera feeds, leaving only the interior security active. What happens out there? I asked. Hayes sat down at his station. You don't want to know yet. You're not ready. But the others, Travis and Jerry, they know. They've seen things they shouldn't have. Hayes looked at me directly for the first time. It changes you, understanding what's out there. The rules exist because people who wrote them paid for the knowledge with their sanity or their lives. I thought about pushing for more information, but something in Hayes's expression stopped me. The haunted look in his eyes suggested he'd seen something beyond ordinary explanation. Get some rest, he said, turning back to his monitors. You can use the cot in the corner. I'll wake you at 05. I laid down on the narrow cot, but sleep seemed impossible. The weight of unspoken horrors hung in the air. Whatever lurked outside in the Arctic darkness, whatever required blood offerings and made those claw marks, had terrified these hardened soldiers into religious adherence to their strange rituals. I closed my eyes but remained alert, listening to the subtle sounds of the outpost, the hum of heating vents, the occasional electronic beep from the monitoring equipment, and what might have been the wind outside, or something else entirely. As I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd walked into something far beyond a standard military assignment. The rules, the blood ritual, the men's behavior, it all pointed to something classified beyond any security clearance I'd ever known existed. Whatever was happening at this remote Arctic outpost, I was now part of it, and I had a sinking feeling that following these 6 strange rules might be the only thing keeping us alive in this frozen hell. I stood beside Hayes in the monitoring room as 0000 hours approached, trying to settle into the rhythm of night watch. My first full day at the outpost had been filled with mundane tasks, equipment checks, inventory counts. and a thorough briefing on emergency protocols that conspicuously avoided mentioning why we needed them. Throughout the day, I'd caught the others watching me when they thought I wasn't looking, as if waiting to see how quickly I'd break. "Your turn to stay awake," Hayes said, nodding toward the small cot in the corner of the room. "I got some sleep earlier. We switch at 0400. I nodded, pulling my chair closer to the bank of monitors showing the interior of the facility. All the exterior cameras had already been switched off, following rule number 2, no looking outside between 0200 and 0500 hours. "So we just sit here in the dark with no eyes outside for 3 hours every night?" I asked. Hayes gave me a sideways look. "Would you rather see what's out there?" Before I could answer, the door opened and Thomas Carter entered, carrying the same ancient metal bowl I'd seen the night before. The markings around its rim seemed to catch the light strangely, almost shimmering despite the dull finish of the metal. "Time," Carter said simply. Hayes checked his watch. 0150. Carter nodded. "Patterson, with me again. You need to learn this procedure exactly." I followed him through the quiet corridors toward the refrigeration unit. The outpost felt different at night. The walls seemed to press inward, and every sound carried an unnatural clarity. As we walked, I noticed Travis sitting alone in the mess hall, staring at a small photo in his hands. He didn't look up as we passed. In the refrigeration unit, Carter selected a blood bag with practiced efficiency. "Always check the expiration date," he said, holding it up to the light. "We can't use anything expired. It doesn't satisfy the requirement." "Sir," I started, measuring my words carefully. "What exactly requires this blood?" Carter's eyes flicked to mine, then back to the blood bag. "Above your clearance, Patterson." "With respect, sir, if I'm going to risk my life following these rules, I'd like to understand why." He finished preparing the bowl before answering. "Understanding is a luxury we don't have here. Compliance keeps us alive." He handed me the bowl. "That's all you need to know right now." We made our way to the north exit, the metal bowl cold in my hands. The dark liquid inside rippled slightly with each step, nearly reaching the strange markings etched into the rim. "Same procedure as last night," Carter instructed as we reached the heavy door. 10 paces out, set it down, straight back, no looking around." He began unlocking the series of mechanisms on the door, each click echoing in the narrow corridor. I noticed fresh scratches on the metal frame that hadn't been there the previous night, thin, curved marks that looked like they'd been made with something sharp. Carter checked his watch. 0159. He paused, hand on the final lock. 30 seconds. We stood in silence, waiting. Carter's focus on his watch was absolute, his body tense as he counted down. "Now." He pulled the door open, and the Arctic air hit me like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped significantly since the previous night, making it hard to breathe. The floodlights illuminated a patch of snow, pristine except for a small circular depression where last night's bowl had been placed. I stepped outside, counting my paces. The cold bit through my uniform immediately. 1, 2, 3. My boots crunched in the snow. 4, 5, 6. The darkness beyond the floodlight's reach seemed to absorb all sound. 7, 8, 9, 10. I set the bowl down carefully and turned to walk back. As I did, I caught a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Something tall and dark, just beyond the light. I kept my eyes forward, remembering Hayes' warning, and walked steadily back to the door where Carter waited. As soon as I was inside, Carter secured the locks with practiced speed. "Good," he said, his voice tight. "Back to your post." We returned to the monitoring room where Hayes sat watching the interior feeds. Jerry had joined him, perched on the edge of a chair, constantly checking his watch. His eyes darted to us as we entered, then immediately back to the digital display on his wrist. "All set?" Hayes asked. Carter nodded. "On schedule." The radio on the desk crackled suddenly with static, making Jerry flinch. Through the white noise, a woman's voice emerged, faint but distinct. "Please, anyone. I need help." The voice sounded young, frightened. "My car broke down. So cold out here." Robert immediately reached over and switched off the radio, his movement so fast it seemed reflexive. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Someone needs help out there." "No one needs help," Robert said flatly. "No one real anyway." Carter looked at me with hard eyes. Rule 6, Patterson. Ignore unrecognized voices on the radio. But that voice cost us Anderson and Michaels last month, Robert cut in, his voice low. They thought they heard a kid crying for help. Went out there at 03:15. His jaw tightened. We found Anderson's boots the next day, just the boots. The room fell silent. I looked at each of their faces, the grim certainty in Carter's eyes, the tightly controlled fear in Robert's, and the twitchy, borderline panic in Jerry's. They believed every word. What about Michaels? I asked finally. We didn't find anything of Michaels, Carter said. The radio remained silent, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. Jerry kept glancing at it nervously while checking his watch. 2:22, he mumbled. Still early. Carter left to check on Travis, leaving me with Hayes and Jerry in the monitoring room. Jerry sat in the corner, as far from the windows as possible, even though the metal shutters were secured tightly over them. So this happens every night? I asked Hayes quietly. The blood, the radio, all of it? Hayes nodded once. The radio doesn't always come on. When it does, it's never good. And you've seen what's out there? What takes the blood? Enough to know better than to look again. Hayes typed something on his keyboard, cycling through interior camera feeds. First tour here. I made that mistake. Caught a glimpse during the blackout hours. He fell silent for a long moment. You don't want what I saw in your head. The door opened and Travis walked in, looking agitated. His eyes were bloodshot and he kept rubbing at his wedding ring. Can't sleep, he muttered, pacing the small space. Too cold in my bunk. He pulled out his wallet and removed a small photo, staring at it intently. Sarah would hate it here. Always gets cold easy, even in summer. Hayes exchanged a look with Jerry, who had stopped checking his watch to stare at Travis. Why don't you try to rest, Travis? Hayes suggested. Long day tomorrow. Travis shook his head. She called me last night, in my dream. He looked up at me suddenly. You ever have dreams so real you can smell her hair, hear her breathing? He laughed, a strange sound that didn't match his expression. Sarah's waiting for me to come home, 43 more days. Jerry stood up abruptly. I need to check the generator. He hurried out of the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Travis continued pacing, talking more to himself than to us. She said she'll be waiting right at the door, right where I left her. Hayes watched him closely. Your wife is fine, Coleman. You talked to her on the scheduled call 3 days ago. She's calling me now, Travis insisted, his voice rising slightly. Can't you hear it? She's out there. I looked at Hayes, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as Travis continued his agitated pacing, muttering about Sarah. Hayes kept his attention divided between the monitors and Travis, who seemed to be working himself into a state. At 03:30, a new sound cut through the hum of equipment, a long, slow scrape against the exterior wall. It moved gradually, like something heavy being dragged across the metal siding of the building. Travis froze mid-step. She's here. Sit down, Coleman, Hayes ordered, his voice firm but quiet. The scraping continued, working its way around the building's perimeter. Each pass sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard, amplified and slowed down. Travis pressed his hands to his ears but couldn't block it out. Why is she outside? He asked, his voice cracking. Why doesn't she come in? That's not your wife, Hayes said, standing up. You know that's not her. The scraping grew louder as it reached the north wall, directly outside our position. Something heavy bumped against the exterior, making the wall shudder slightly. Travis took an involuntary step toward the shuttered window. Don't, I warned, remembering rule number 2. Hayes moved quickly, positioning himself between Travis and the window. Focus, Coleman. Look at me. His voice was commanding. That's not Sarah out there. Sarah is in Portland. Remember? Travis's eyes darted between Hayes and the shuttered window. The scraping continued, methodical and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was testing the structure for weaknesses. She sounds like Sarah, Travis whispered. I hadn't heard any voice, just the scraping. Hayes shot me a warning look, shaking his head slightly. 40 more minutes, Hayes said, checking his watch. Just hold it together for 40 more minutes. The scraping and occasional heavy thumps continued for what felt like hours, but was only 20 minutes according to the clock. Then, at 03:50, they stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost worse. Travis slumped in his chair, exhausted. "She's gone," he said quietly, sounding both relieved and disappointed. I watched him tuck the photo of Sarah back into his wallet with trembling hands. Hayes relaxed slightly but kept his position between Travis and the window. We remained like that, tense and silent, until 0500 hours arrived. Hayes immediately went to the console and reactivated the exterior cameras. "Clear," he announced after checking each feed. "Blackout hours are over." Carter returned shortly after, looking as if he hadn't slept. "Report." "Radio contact at 0215, Hayes said. Female voice requesting assistance. Scraping and impacts on exterior from 0330 to 0350. Coleman experienced auditory hallucinations. Carter nodded as if this was exactly what he expected. "Patterson, with me. Morning check." The sky outside was still dark when we stepped out the main entrance, but a faint glow on the horizon suggested dawn wasn't far off. Carter led me toward the north side of the building where I had placed the bowl hours earlier. "Standard procedure," Carter explained. "Check the perimeter every morning after blackout hours." The bowl sat exactly where I had left it, but it was completely empty. Not even a stain remained in the metal. Around it, the snow was disturbed in ways that made no sense. Large, elongated impressions led away from the bowl toward the distant tree line. They were roughly foot-shaped but much larger than any human foot, with strange additional markings beside each step, as if something had been dragging alongside. "What made these?" I asked, kneeling to examine them closer. "Don't touch them," Carter warned sharply. "Don't even look at them too long." I straightened up, backing away from the tracks. "But what? Curiosity is dangerous here, Patterson." Carter collected the empty bowl. "Williams, our last security specialist before Erickson, decided he wanted to follow the tracks one morning. Got about 50 yards before we lost sight of him." He gestured toward the tree line. "He never came back." "You didn't look for him?" "We heard him that night on the radio." Carter's expression was grim, begging us to let him in. Breaking Rule 6 killed 2 more men who thought they were helping a comrade. We walked the perimeter in silence, Carter examining the walls of the facility with practiced attention. I noticed more fresh scratches along the metal siding, some of them deep enough to have nearly penetrated the outer shell. Whatever had made these marks was powerful. "Temperature's dropping again," Carter noted as we completed our circuit. "Forecast says another 10 degrees down by nightfall." Back inside, the outpost was stirring to life as the day shift began. Jerry emerged from his quarters looking like he hadn't slept, still checking his watch compulsively. Travis sat in the mess hall, staring into a cup of coffee, the photo of Sarah propped against it. "Get some rest," Carter told me. "You're back on at 2000 hours." In my small quarters, I laid on the thin mattress and tried to process what I'd experienced. The strange rituals, the sounds in the night, the tracks in the snow. It all pointed to something beyond rational explanation. The men's fear was too genuine, their adherence to the rules too strict, for this to be some elaborate hazing ritual. Something was out there in the darkness, something that accepted blood offerings and left inhuman tracks in the snow, something that could mimic human voices and test the walls of our shelter with methodical determination. As exhaustion finally pulled me toward sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. Whatever was out there, it would be back again tonight, and the night was coming sooner than I wanted. I woke to complete darkness, momentarily disoriented in my windowless quarters. The digital clock beside my bunk read 1600 hours. I'd slept longer than intended. Outside my door, the facility hummed with the sound of the heating system fighting against the plummeting Arctic temperatures. Carter had been right about the forecast. I could feel the increased effort in the building's mechanical systems. When I emerged from my quarters, the common areas were quiet. Robert sat at the monitoring station, his attention fixed on the exterior camera feeds. During daylight hours, we kept constant surveillance on the perimeter, though no one had explained exactly what we were watching for. "How cold?" I asked, pouring myself coffee from the pot in the small kitchenette. "-63 and dropping," Robert answered without looking away from the screens. "Storm front coming in from the north." The way he said "north" carried a weight beyond simple direction. Everything about the north side of this facility felt wrong. The door with its claw marks, the ritual with the blood bowl, the tracks I'd seen in the snow that morning. I took my coffee to the mess hall where Jerry sat alone, eyes fixed on his watch. The constant time checking had begun to seem less like a nervous tic and more like a survival mechanism. He barely acknowledged my presence. "Where's Travis?" I asked. Jerry's eyes flicked up momentarily. "Talking to Carter. Again." The way he said it suggested this wasn't an ordinary conversation. I'd noticed Travis's deteriorating state the previous night, his fixation on his wife, the way he'd responded to something no one else could hear. I wondered if Carter was addressing the issue. "And the third night is always the worst," Jerry added quietly, almost to himself. "What do you mean?" He finally looked at me directly. "First night, you hear it. Second night, it learns your name. Third night." He trailed off, checking his watch again. Erickson broke on his third night too. Before I could press him for details, the door to Carter's office opened. Travis emerged, looking pale but composed, followed by Carter, whose expression gave nothing away. Travis headed straight for his quarters without looking at either of us. Carter approached our table. "Patterson, prep for early shift tonight. Weather's turning bad. We need to complete the ritual before the storm hits full force." "Yes, sir," I replied, noting that he'd referred to the blood bowl as the ritual without his usual clinical detachment. "Jerry, double-check all emergency systems. If this storm knocks out power, I want backup generators ready." Carter's tone was measured but tense. "And make sure all shutters are secured properly. Every window." Jerry nodded rapidly, his eyes darting to his watch again. The hours passed with growing unease. The wind picked up outside, howling around the corners of the facility with increasing fury. Through the still exposed windows, I watched daylight fade completely by 17:30, leaving us surrounded by darkness far earlier than normal. The exterior floodlights cut cones of visibility into the swirling snow, but beyond their reach was absolute blackness. At 1900 hours, we gathered in the mess hall for a quick meal. Travis appeared, looking worse than before. His eyes were sunken, skin pale, and he kept touching his wedding ring as if to reassure himself it was still there. He ate nothing, just stared at a cup of coffee growing cold between his hands. The photo of Sarah sat propped against it as usual. Robert and I exchanged glances across the table. Something was definitely wrong with Travis, but none of us seemed to know how to address it. This place had its own rules for survival, and they didn't include confronting someone else's psychological breakdown. "Storm's getting worse," Carter announced as he entered. "Patterson, Hayes, night shift starts now. Coleman, you should rest." His tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Travis didn't move. "She doesn't like storms," he said quietly, eyes still fixed on his coffee. "Sarah always gets scared when the power might go out." "Your wife is fine, Coleman," Carter said firmly. "Portland isn't experiencing any storm." Travis looked up, his expression suddenly lucid. "I know where she is." The way he said it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Carter ordered Travis to his quarters, assigning Jerry to keep him company, clearly a euphemism for keeping watch. I followed Robert to the monitoring room to begin our shift, noticing how he carefully averted his eyes from the windows as we passed them, despite it not yet being blackout hours. "Travis isn't handling isolation well," I remarked as we settled into our stations. Robert's face remained impassive. "It's not the isolation." He offered nothing more, focusing instead on the exterior cameras that showed snow whipping horizontally past the floodlights. Visibility was down to less than 20 feet. At 01:30, Carter arrived with the metal bowl. The ritual preparation proceeded as before, but with added urgency. "Storm's playing hell with the perimeter sensors," Carter explained as he checked the blood bag. "We need to be extra vigilant tonight." Robert's posture stiffened at this news. "Temperature?" "-71, Carter replied, wind chill taking it lower. When we reached the north door, the procedure changed slightly. Carter handed me the bowl but kept his hand on my arm. 10 paces as usual, but move fast. This weather..." He stopped himself. "Just be quick." The moment he unlocked the door, the wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it against the wall. The force of the gale nearly knocked me back, carrying snow and ice particles that stung my face like needles. The floodlights barely penetrated the whiteout conditions. I stepped outside, the bowl clutched tightly in my hands. The cold was beyond anything I'd experienced, not just painful but actively hostile, as if the air itself wanted to freeze the life from my body. I counted my steps, barely able to see where I was placing my feet in the swirling snow. At 10 paces, I set the bowl down, making sure it was stable in the snow. As I turned back, the wind shifted direction suddenly, and through a momentary break in the snow, I caught a glimpse of something tall and dark at the edge of the light's reach. It didn't move like something affected by the storm. It stood perfectly still despite the gale-force winds, a darker shape against the darkness. I hurried back to the door where Carter waited, securing it behind me with what seemed like extra checks of each lock. "Did you see anything?" he asked sharply. "No," I lied, not entirely sure why. "Just the storm." We returned to the monitoring room where Robert waited, all exterior cameras now switched off for blackout hours. Jerry appeared in the doorway looking anxious. "Travis is sleeping," he reported. "Finally took something for it." Carter nodded. "Good. Stay vigilant tonight. This weather makes things unpredictable." After Carter left, the three of us maintained an uneasy silence in the monitoring room. The storm battered the facility, metal creaking under the onslaught of wind and ice. Occasionally, a deeper sound would emerge from beneath the storm's howl, something that might have been the wind catching on the building's exterior features, or might have been something else entirely. At 0240, the door flew open, and Travis stood there, wild-eyed and disheveled. He shouldn't have been awake, let alone moving around. "She's here," he announced, his voice unnaturally calm despite his appearance. "Sarah's outside." Jerry jumped up from his chair. "Travis, you need to go back to your bunk. She's calling me." Travis turned and walked rapidly down the corridor toward the north section of the facility. Robert and I exchanged alarmed looks before following him, with Jerry close behind. We caught up to Travis at the window nearest the north door, the same one where the Blood Bowl ritual took place outside. His hands were already on the metal shutter latch. "Travis, stop," I called out, remembering rule number 2. "You know we can't look outside now." "She needs me." He began raising the shutter, the mechanism squealing from lack of use. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "Travis, think about what you're doing." He shook me off with surprising strength. "I know what I heard." Robert moved to help me restrain him, but Travis had already pulled the shutter up, exposing the window to the night outside. The glass was frosted over, obscuring the view, but Travis pressed his face against it anyway, using his sleeve to clear a small section. "Travis, get away from there!" Robert shouted, real fear in his voice for the first time since I'd met him. I grabbed Travis's shoulder to pull him back, but froze at the touch. Even through his uniform, his skin felt like ice. Not the normal cold of a person, but the deep, penetrating cold of metal left in a freezer. It made no sense. The interior of the facility was heated to a comfortable level. Travis stood utterly still, face pressed against the glass, mouth slightly open. His breath should have fogged the window, but I saw no condensation forming. "Sarah," he whispered, voice filled with wonder. "You came." I looked at the window but saw nothing through the small clear patch except swirling darkness and snow. Yet Travis was clearly seeing something, his eyes tracking movement. "I missed you so much," he continued as if having a conversation. Yes, I can do that." Robert was trying to contact Carter on the radio while Jerry stood frozen in the corridor, his eyes wide with terror. "Travis," I tried again, my hand still on his impossibly cold shoulder. "There's nothing out there. Come back to your bunk." He didn't seem to hear me. "I understand," he whispered to the window. "I'll come out to you." At that moment, Travis's body went completely rigid. His head snapped back, eyes rolling up until only the whites showed. A terrible scream tore from his throat, not fear, but agony, as if something was being ripped from inside him. Blood began streaming from his nose, dark against his pale skin. His legs gave out and he collapsed to the floor. I managed to catch him before his head hit the ground, easing him down. His skin was now so cold it burned my hands to touch him. Robert was beside me instantly, checking Travis's pulse. "We need to get him to his bunk, now." Together, Robert and Jerry lifted Travis while I closed and secured the shutter. As they carried his limp form down the corridor, I glanced back at the now covered window. Through the metal of the shutter, I could swear I heard something, a faint, melodic sound. A woman's voice singing. The melody was wrong, though. It moved too slowly, the notes stretching unnaturally as if played at half speed. The tune was almost recognizable, like a lullaby distorted into something sinister. In Travis's quarters, we laid him on his bunk. He was unconscious, but alive, his breathing shallow and irregular. His skin remained ice cold to the touch despite the blankets Robert piled on him. Carter arrived moments later, his face grim as he checked Travis's vital signs. "Temperature's dangerously low," he reported. 68 degrees. He looked up at us. "Severe hypothermia, but that's impossible. He hasn't been outside." "He looked out the window," Jerry said, voice trembling. "During blackout hours." Carter's expression hardened. "Did any of you look?" We all shook our heads. "What did he see out there?" I asked. "Nothing," Carter said firmly. There was nothing to see. But Travis's condition told a different story. His skin had taken on a bluish tinge, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing minute. Carter administered emergency treatment for hypothermia, but nothing seemed to help. Travis's body temperature continued to drop. Throughout it all, I could still hear that singing, faint but persistent, coming through the walls from the direction of the north window. The melody crawled along my spine like ice water, familiar yet fundamentally wrong. None of the others mentioned hearing it, and I didn't ask if they did. We maintained a vigil in Travis's room, monitoring his deteriorating condition. Jerry kept whispering about the third night until Carter ordered him to be quiet. Robert stood stoically by the door, expression unreadable. At 04:30, Travis suddenly opened his eyes. They were no longer rolled back, but instead stared straight ahead, unseeing. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Travis?" Carter leaned closer. "Can you hear me?" Travis's mouth continued moving silently for several seconds before his breathing pattern changed, becoming even more labored. Each exhale produced a small cloud of visible vapor, as if the air around him had dropped below freezing despite the room's warmth. The singing outside grew louder as 0500 approached. I found myself straining to make out words in the melody, but there were none. Or if there were, they weren't in any language I recognized. Exactly at 0500, two things happened simultaneously. The singing stopped abruptly, and Travis exhaled one final breath. The vapor hung above his lips for a moment, before dissipating. Carter checked for a pulse, then closed Travis's staring eyes. "He's gone." The room fell silent except for the howling of the storm outside. Travis's body lay still on the bunk, his skin pallid with a bluish tint, frost crystals visible on his eyelashes and in his hair. The medical thermometer beside the bed read 61 degrees, a body temperature incompatible with life. "Hypothermia," Carter said quietly, though his tone suggested he didn't believe the diagnosis himself. Despite being indoors the entire time, Robert finally spoke. It was the window. He saw something he shouldn't have. Jerry was shaking, tears streaming down his face. "Third night," he whispered. "Always the third night." Carter stood up, his movements mechanical. "Secure the body. We'll arrange transport when the storm passes. Until then, we continue operations." His clinical detachment seemed forced, a thin veneer over whatever emotions he was actually feeling. He turned to me. "Patterson, double-check all shutters. Make sure everyone is secured." As the others prepared Travis's body, I moved through the facility, checking each window covering. The storm continued to rage outside, but the singing had stopped completely. When I returned to the north window where Travis had broken, I paused, listening carefully. Nothing but the wind. I secured the shutter tightly, adding an extra lock that had been stored nearby. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor that I hadn't seen before, a small silver object gleaming in the corridor light. I picked it up. It was Travis's wedding ring, somehow pulled from his finger and left here by the window. The metal was ice cold, nearly freezing to my touch. I pocketed it, intending to return it to his body. Back in Travis's quarters, Carter had covered the body with a sheet. Jerry sat in the corner, still visibly shaken, while Robert stood guard at the door. "Found this by the window," I said, holding out the wedding ring. "It must have fallen off." Carter took it, examining it closely. "It didn't fall off," he said after a moment. "Look." He pulled back the sheet covering Travis's left hand. The ring finger was there, but the skin where the ring had been was discolored, blackened as if with severe frostbite. "Something took it from him," Carter said quietly, "and left it for us to find." The implications of that statement hung in the air between us. Something had reached through that window, or through Travis, and removed the ring from his finger. Something that sang with a woman's voice and called itself Sarah. I stared at Travis's body, thinking about how he had been so focused on his wife, so desperate to return to her. Had that made him vulnerable? Or had something out there specifically targeted that connection? The storm's howling seemed to mock us as we stood vigil over our fallen comrade. The rules that had seemed so strange to me upon arrival now felt like fragile shields against a darkness I was only beginning to comprehend. Travis had broken one of those rules, and whatever waited outside during the blackout hours had claimed him for it. 2 hours later, when the power failed completely, I realized that Travis's death was only the beginning. I lay on my bunk in the darkened room, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion. 2 hours had passed since Travis's death, and the image of his frozen body haunted me each time I closed my eyes. The ring we'd found, the wedding band that had somehow been removed from his blackened finger, sat on the small table beside Carter's bunk across the room. None of us had wanted to keep it, but leaving it with Travis's body felt wrong somehow. The storm continued to rage outside, battering the outpost with wind and snow. The heating system worked overtime, its mechanical drone a constant reminder of how thin the barrier was between us and the lethal cold. Robert and Jerry had retreated to their own quarters after helping Carter prepare Travis's body for eventual transport. Carter had insisted on following proper protocols despite our isolation, wrapping Travis in a body bag and securing it to his bunk with straps. The clinical efficiency with which Carter had performed this task struck me as both professional and disturbing, as if he'd done it many times before. I was contemplating this when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The heating system's constant hum cut out mid-cycle, leaving an absolute silence broken only by the howling wind outside. Rule 3 echoed instantly in my mind: remain stationary if power fails. I froze in my bunk, not even daring to sit up. The darkness was total, not the partial darkness of night with faint outlines still visible, but complete blackness that pressed against my eyes like a physical weight. Without windows in our sleeping quarters, not even the faintest hint of light penetrated the space. The temperature began to drop immediately. Within seconds, I could feel the cold creeping through the building as the Arctic night clawed its way inside. My breath formed visible clouds that I could sense rather than see. 1 minute passed. 2. The emergency generator should have kicked in by now. "What's happening?" I whispered, keeping my body completely still. "Don't move," came Carter's voice from across the room, barely audible. "Under no circumstances move from your position." A third minute passed. The temperature continued to plummet, and I pulled my blanket tighter around me without shifting my position. The cold had a predatory quality to it, seeking out any exposed skin with icy precision. Then came the knocking. It started at the north door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the silent facility. Not the random pounding of debris thrown by the storm, but deliberate, purposeful knocks. They came again, faster this time, forming a rhythm too quick and precise to be human. The pattern was wrong somehow, as if whatever was knocking had too many limbs or moved them too quickly. I held my breath, listening as the knocking intensified, growing more insistent with each passing second. The door rattled in its frame, the metal groaning under repeated impacts. "Stay still," Robert whispered from somewhere to my left. The generators failed twice before. Both times we lost someone who tried to fix it. "What happened to them?" I asked through barely moving lips. Banks panicked during the first failure, grabbed a flashlight and headed for the generator room. "We found pieces of him the next morning." Robert's voice was tight, controlled. Second time, Richards made it halfway there before the screaming started. The knocking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, filled with anticipation. I strained my ears, listening for any sound beyond our shallow breathing. After a long moment, I heard it. Footsteps inside the building. Slow, measured steps moving down the corridor outside our quarters. They didn't sound like boots on metal flooring. Instead, they made a wet, slapping sound, like bare feet on the cold surface. But all 4 remaining soldiers were accounted for in their bunks. The footsteps paused outside our door. I heard a faint scratching, then the handle turned slowly. The door creaked open, letting in no additional light, just more cold air that washed over us like a wave. The footsteps resumed, entering our room. They moved with purpose, stopping briefly beside each bunk. I sensed, rather than saw, something standing over Carter's bed, then moving to Robert's, then Jerry's. Jerry began to whimper quietly, a sound so filled with terror it made my skin crawl. "Please," he whispered. "Please, no." "Quiet," Carter hissed. The footsteps approached my bunk next. I lay perfectly still, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but remain exposed and vulnerable in the darkness. The cold intensified around me, as if whatever stood beside my bed absorbed all heat from its surroundings. Something brushed against my face, a touch so cold it burned my skin. It felt like fingers, but wrong somehow. Too long, too thin, with too many joints. They traced a line from my forehead to my chin, lingering at my throat for a terrifying moment before withdrawing. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The footsteps continued their circuit of the room, returning to Travis's body bag. The sound of a zipper being slowly opened cut through the darkness. Fabric rustled, followed by a heavy dragging sound across the floor. Jerry's whimpering grew louder, edging toward hysteria. "They're taking him," he whispered. "They're taking him away." "Don't look," Robert warned. "Even if the lights come back on, don't look at it." The dragging sound moved toward the door, accompanied by those wet, slapping footsteps. Something heavy bumped against the doorframe, then continued into the corridor. 7 minutes had passed since the power failed. The temperature had dropped so low that breathing hurt, the cold air scraping my lungs with each inhale. Ice crystals had formed on my blanket and eyelashes. 8 minutes. The footsteps and dragging sounds faded down the corridor toward the north exit. The knocking resumed, but from the inside this time, something requesting to be let out rather than in. Then, with a mechanical groan, the generator finally kicked in. Lights flickered on throughout the facility, and the heating system roared back to life with an almost desperate intensity. The footsteps stopped immediately. The knocking ceased. The sudden silence was broken only by the familiar hum of equipment returning to normal operation. None of us moved for several long seconds. Then Carter sat up slowly, surveying the room. "Report," he ordered, voice steady despite what we'd just experienced. "Present," Robert replied. "Present," I added. Jerry made a small, choked sound that might have been present. Carter stood and moved to check Travis's bunk. The body bag lay open and empty, the straps that had secured it neatly unbuckled and laid aside. There was no sign of Travis's body, no trail of blood or fluids, nothing to indicate how it had been removed or where it had gone. "Secure the facility," Carter ordered, his face betraying no emotion. "Full sweep, teams of 2. Hayes, with me. Patterson, stay with Mitchell." As they left, I turned to Jerry, who sat huddled on his bunk, arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His eyes were wide, darting around the room as if expecting something to materialize from the shadows despite the lights being on. "You okay?" I asked, knowing it was a ridiculous question. Jerry shook his head rapidly. "I saw it," he whispered. "When the lights came on, just for a second, I saw it carrying Travis." He pressed his hands against his eyes. "It wasn't right. It wasn't shaped right." "What do you mean?" I moved closer, keeping my voice low. "Too many." Jerry struggled to find words. "Too many parts. Too many eyes." He lowered his hands, looking at me with raw terror. "It saw me too. It looked right at me, and his voice broke. It smiled." The heating system had begun to restore warmth to the room, but I felt a new chill at Jerry's words. I remembered the cold touch on my face, the wrong-feeling fingers with too many joints. "Did you see where it took him?" I asked. Jerry nodded slowly. "North door. It was taking him outside." A sob escaped him. "To the others." "Others?" "All the ones who broke the rules," Jerry whispered. "All the ones who looked outside during blackout hours, or moved during power failures, or answered the wrong voices on the radio." He rocked slightly back and forth. "They're all out there now, and Travis is with them." Carter and Robert returned 20 minutes later, their search complete. The north door remained locked and secure, showing no signs of being opened. All other exits were similarly untouched. Travis's body was simply gone, as if it had never existed. "No breach in the perimeter," Carter reported. "No signs of entry or exit." "So whatever took Travis," I began. "We don't discuss it," Carter cut me off. "We follow the rules. We survive." He checked his watch. "Dawn in 2 hours. We maintain normal operations until extraction." I wanted to argue, to demand explanations for what had just happened, but the hollow look in Carter's eyes stopped me. This wasn't denial or willful ignorance. This was a man who had seen too much already and knew that understanding brought no comfort, only more terror. We retreated to our respective positions, Robert and I to the monitoring room, Carter to his office, and Jerry back to his bunk where he continued to tremble and whisper to himself. The facility felt different now, as if the boundaries between our world and whatever existed outside had thinned during those 8 minutes of darkness. As I watched the interior camera feeds, I kept seeing movement at the edge of my vision. Shadows that shifted when viewed directly. Cold spots that moved from room to room. The outpost felt occupied by something beyond the four of us. Something that had walked our corridors with those wet, slapping footsteps and taken Travis's body for purposes I couldn't begin to comprehend. I touched my face where those cold fingers had traced my features, wondering why the entity had touched me but left me behind. What made Travis suitable for taking but not me? The question brought no comfort, only a creeping dread that my evaluation wasn't yet complete. The storm continued to rage outside, and I found myself hoping it would delay any extraction, because the thought of stepping outside, of crossing the open ground to a helicopter while surrounded by the darkness that had claimed Travis, filled me with a terror beyond anything I'd ever known. I spent the remaining hours before dawn in the monitoring room with Robert, both of us watching the cameras for any sign of movement. The temperature had climbed back to a barely tolerable -58 degrees as the storm finally began to weaken. Neither of us mentioned what had happened during the power failure or the empty body bag that still lay open on Travis's bunk. Some experiences defied discussion. The sun rose at 9:17, not that we could tell much difference. The perpetual Arctic winter meant daylight was just a slightly lighter shade of gray that lasted a few hours before plunging us back into darkness. Robert reactivated the exterior cameras as usual at 500 hours, revealing nothing but fresh snow with no footprints or drag marks, no evidence that Travis had been removed from the building. "I need to check the perimeter," Robert said, pulling on his cold weather gear. "You should get some rest." I shook my head. I'd rather stay busy. The truth was, I feared what might come in my sleep after what I'd experienced. The sensation of those wrong-shaped fingers touching my face lingered like a cold brand on my skin. We were preparing the morning meal when the first scream echoed through the facility. It came from the communications room where Jerry had gone to perform the scheduled 600 hours check-in with command. Robert and I ran toward the sound, finding Carter already at the sealed door, pounding with his fist. "Mitchell, open up!" he shouted. Another scream came from inside, followed by a crash of equipment hitting the floor. "They're in my head!" Jerry screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "They won't shut up!" Carter tried the handle, but Jerry had barricaded the door from inside. Through the small window in the door, I caught glimpses of Jerry moving frantically around the room, clutching his head and speaking to empty air. "Who's talking to you, Mitchell?" Carter asked, keeping his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. "All of them," Jerry wailed. "Everyone who broke the rules. They're all outside, but they're in my head too, and they won't stop talking." I heard a series of sharp cracks as Jerry began destroying equipment inside. The radio used for hourly check-ins smashed against the wall, components scattering across the floor. He picked up the microphone and spoke into it despite having disconnected it from any power source. "Yes, I hear you," he said, suddenly calm. "I understand the new rules." Carter exchanged an alarmed look with Robert. "Mitchell, there are no new rules. You know the 6 rules. We follow them. We survive." Jerry laughed, a sound entirely devoid of humor. "The old rules are wrong," he said, his voice taking on an unsettling sing-song quality. "They gave me better ones, newer ones." He pressed his face against the window in the door, and I took an involuntary step back. His eyes darted wildly between us, pupils so dilated they nearly swallowed the iris. "Rule 1, Jerry whispered. "Open the north door at 3:13. "Those aren't our rules, Mitchell," Carter said firmly. "You know the real rules. Focus on those." "Rule 2, Jerry continued as if Carter hadn't spoken. "Bring no more blood. They don't want it anymore." Robert moved beside Carter. "We need to get in there, now." Carter nodded and stepped back. "On 3. They slammed their shoulders against the door simultaneously. The barricade inside shifted but held. They tried again with more force. "Rule 3, Jerry called out, his voice rising in pitch. "Let them inside so they can finally stay warm." The door gave way on the third attempt, sending Carter and Robert stumbling into the communications room. I followed, keeping my distance as Jerry backed away from us, still clutching the disconnected microphone. The room was in shambles. Every piece of communications equipment lay smashed or dismantled. The satellite radio for emergency communications had been methodically disassembled, its components arranged in a strange pattern on the floor. A crude circle with lines radiating outward like a child's drawing of the sun. Jerry stood in the center of this arrangement, sweat pouring down his face despite the chill in the room. "You shouldn't have come in," he said, his voice suddenly dropping an octave. "They were almost finished telling me what to do." Carter approached him slowly, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Jerry, you've been through a lot. We all have. But we need to stick together and follow the original rules." "The original rules only delay them," Jerry said, backing toward the far wall. "They're already inside with us. Can't you see them? They're standing right there." He pointed to the empty space beside me, and I fought the urge to look over my shoulder. Robert moved to flank Jerry from the left while Carter continued his careful approach. "No one's there, Mitchell," Carter said. "You're exhausted and stressed. Let us help you." "Rule 4, Jerry whispered, ignoring Carter completely. "Bring the others outside one by one." He lunged suddenly toward the door, but Robert intercepted him, wrapping his arms around Jerry's midsection and taking them both to the floor. Jerry fought with surprising strength, screaming about voices and new rules. Carter joined the struggle, trying to pin Jerry's flailing arms. "Patterson! The medical kit! Sedatives!" I ran to the medical bay, returning with the emergency kit Carter had shown me during orientation. Inside was a prepared syringe labeled for extreme agitation. As I approached with the medication, Jerry's struggles intensified. "They'll peel your skin off while you sleep," he screamed, his voice rising to an impossible pitch. "They'll wear your face while you watch." He twisted violently and bit into Carter's hand as Carter tried to restrain him. Carter grunted in pain but maintained his grip as blood welled from the wound. "Now!" Carter ordered through gritted teeth. I administered the sedative while Robert held Jerry as still as possible. Within seconds, Jerry's movements began to slow, though he continued to mutter about rules and voices. Then he went completely still, his eyes open but unfocused. As the sedative took full effect, I noticed something disturbing. Jerry's eyes had changed. The pupils had expanded until barely any iris remained, giving the impression of eyes that were completely black. They reflected the overhead lights oddly, like polished obsidian rather than living tissue. "What's wrong with his eyes?" I asked quietly. Carter checked Jerry's pulse, ignoring my question. "Help me get him to the medical bay. We need to secure him before he wakes up." We carried Jerry's unconscious form to the medical bay where Carter had metal restraints attached to one of the beds, equipment I hadn't noticed during my initial tour. They looked older than everything else in the facility, their surface scored with deep scratches. "This has happened before," I said, watching as Robert efficiently secured Jerry's wrists and ankles. Carter wrapped a bandage around his bleeding hand. "More often than command admits." "And the eyes?" I pressed. "Part of the progression," he said flatly. "Once they start hearing the voices, physical changes follow." Robert finished securing the restraints and stepped back. "He won't be the first to try opening that north door during blackout hours." "And he won't be the last," Carter added, his voice heavy with resignation. We established a rotating watch over Jerry, who remained unconscious for several hours. I took the first shift, sitting across from his restrained form, watching for any signs of returning consciousness. Despite the sedative, his lips continued to move, forming words without sound. Occasionally, his head would turn as if listening to someone speaking beside his bed, though we were alone in the room. Robert relieved me after 4 hours, and I went to get something to eat. The facility felt emptier with Travis gone and Jerry incapacitated. The walls seemed to press inward, the corridors narrower than before. I tried to dismiss it as psychological, stress and sleep deprivation distorting my perception, but the feeling persisted. I found Carter in his office reviewing logs on his computer. His bandaged hand rested awkwardly on the desk. "How's the bite?" I asked. He glanced at his hand. "Clean enough. Mitchell's not the problem." "Then what is?" Carter looked up at me, his expression grim. "Whatever got inside his head. Whatever's been testing our defenses every night." "You still haven't told me what these things are," I said, taking a seat across from him. "Because I don't know," Carter replied, shutting down his computer. "None of us do. Command sends us here with rules, but no explanations. The rules work if you follow them exactly. Until they don't, I countered, thinking of Travis, who had followed every rule until his wife's voice called to him from outside. Carter's jaw tightened. Travis broke Rule 2. He looked outside during blackout hours. And Jerry? What rule did he break? None yet, Carter said. But he will. They always do once the voices start. He rubbed. 4 days passed with agonizing slowness. Each minute stretched like an hour, each hour like a day. Robert and I followed every rule with painstaking precision, placing the blood bowl at exactly 200 hours, avoiding windows during blackout, remaining perfectly still during the 2 additional brief power failures we experienced. We spoke little, conserving energy and focus for the rituals that kept us alive. Jerry remained sedated in the medical bay. His black eyes would occasionally open, staring at nothing while his lips formed words we couldn't hear. Robert and I took turns monitoring him, changing his IV fluids and recording his vital signs in the log. His pulse grew weaker each day, his breathing shallower. We both knew he wouldn't survive extraction, but neither of us said it aloud. Thomas had grown worse with each passing day. He no longer slept at all, his eyes bloodshot and skin gray with exhaustion. I caught him checking the locks on the north door 17 times during a single hour yesterday. He carried a loaded sidearm now, something I hadn't seen him do before, and jumped at the smallest sounds. Final night, Robert said as we prepared for darkness on our 7th day. Extraction scheduled for 0800 tomorrow. I nodded, afraid to express relief or hope. The outpost had taught me that anticipation was dangerous, a vulnerability that could be exploited. If the weather holds, I said instead. Weather report shows clear conditions, Thomas said, entering the monitoring room. He looked terrible, his uniform wrinkled and stained, a week's growth of beard on his face. We maintain full protocol until the helicopter lands. No exceptions. Understood, Robert and I said in unison. Thomas checked his watch. 21:47, 13 minutes until we begin prep for the blood ritual. He moved to each monitor in sequence, checking the camera feeds with obsessive attention. Report any anomalies immediately. When he left, Robert leaned closer to me. He's been through 8 rotations here, longest serving commander on record. How is that possible? I asked, keeping my voice low. What he's seen, what he's lost. Some people can compartmentalize better than others, Robert replied. Or maybe he just doesn't have anywhere else to go. At 2200 hours, we retrieved the bowl and blood bag as usual. Thomas accompanied us to the north door, checking the locks 3 times before opening it. The night was clear and still, stars visible in the black sky above. The cold sliced through my layers like a knife as I placed the bowl in its usual spot and returned without looking around. Back in the monitoring room, we deactivated the exterior cameras for blackout hours. Jerry had destroyed our primary radio days ago, but Thomas insisted we maintain the backup radio for emergency communication with command. He placed it on the monitoring desk between Robert and me. I'll patrol the corridors, Thomas said. Stay vigilant. The hours passed in tense silence. Robert and I watched the interior cameras while listening to the building's familiar creaks and groans as the metal contracted in the cold. At 01:30, we heard Thomas's measured footsteps passing the monitoring room door for what must have been the 20th time. At 02:45, the radio crackled to life with a burst of static that made us both jump. Hello? Can anyone hear me? The voice that emerged from the speaker was my own, perfectly matched in tone, cadence, and accent. This is David Patterson. I need immediate assistance. My team is dead, and I'm stranded outside. I felt the blood drain from my face as my own voice continued pleading through the radio. Robert reached for the volume control, turning it down but not off. I can see the lights of the outpost. Please, if anyone can hear me, I've been out here for hours. My supplies are gone, and I'm freezing. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his hand on his weapon. Shut it off, he ordered. Wait, my voice said through the radio as if hearing Thomas. I know you're in there, Thomas. I know you can hear me. Please, I'm the real Patterson. Whatever's in there with you is the imposter. Robert grabbed the radio and smashed it against the edge of the desk. The plastic casing shattered, components spilling across the floor. He stomped on the circuit board for good measure, grinding it under his boot. Rule 6, Robert said, his voice tight. Ignore unrecognized voices on the radio. But it was my voice, I said, still processing what I'd heard. How could it? It wasn't you, Thomas said firmly. You're here, That's all that matters. At exactly 0300, the first impact hit the north wall. It felt like something massive had slammed into the building's exterior, hard enough that the floor vibrated beneath our feet. The lights flickered but held. "It's starting," Thomas whispered, drawing his sidearm. A second impact came 30 seconds later, stronger than the first. Then another and another. Each blow seemed to land with calculated precision, testing different sections of the building's exterior. The metal walls groaned under the assault. "What's happening?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Final night protocol," Thomas replied, moving to check the interior cameras. "They always test us harder before extraction." The impacts continued, growing in intensity and frequency until the entire structure shook continuously. Equipment rattled on desks, ceiling panels vibrated in their frames. Something was methodically striking every section of the outpost, moving in a pattern I couldn't discern. "They're angry," Robert said quietly. "They know we're leaving." Thomas positioned himself in the corridor, watching both directions with his weapon drawn. I monitored the interior cameras, tracking the progression of impacts around the perimeter. At 0345, I noticed movement on the cameras overlooking the corridors. Dark shapes passed the lenses in quick succession, like shadows detached from their sources. They weren't fully visible, more like smudges or distortions in the air that moved with purpose. "Carter," I called, using his last name as protocol demanded in crisis situations. "Something's on the internal cameras." He appeared at my side instantly, studying the feeds. "Where?" Before I could answer, the window shutters in the monitoring room rattled violently. Despite every instinct screaming at me to look, I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, remembering Travis's fate. "Don't look up," Thomas ordered, raising his weapon toward the window. "Whatever happens, keep your eyes down." Through my peripheral vision, I caught glimpses of shapes moving past the narrow gaps in the shutters. Humanoid but wrong. Proportions distorted, movements too fluid. Some tall and thin, others hunched and twisted. They passed back and forth like patrollers seeking entry. The impacts against the building intensified, focusing on the north door. Each blow made the entire structure shudder. The lights flickered repeatedly as the power system struggled under the assault. "They've never been this aggressive," Robert said, his composure finally cracking. "Not in all my time here." Thomas said nothing, his attention fixed on the door to the corridor where more of those shadow-like distortions passed by. His knuckles were white around the grip of his weapon. We endured the assault for what felt like hours, but was only minutes according to the clock. The temperature in the room dropped steadily until our breath clouded in front of us. Ice crystals formed in the corners where ceiling met wall. Then, at exactly 0500 hours, everything stopped. The impacts ceased. The shadows vanished from the cameras. The temperature began to slowly rise again. Thomas checked his watch. Blackout hours ended. Reactivate exterior cameras. Robert complied, bringing the outside feeds back online. The cameras showed nothing but empty snow surrounding the outpost, unmarked and pristine despite the violent assault we'd experienced. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, nothing to indicate anything had been there at all. "Clear the facility," Thomas ordered. "Full sweep, standard protocol." We spent the next 2 hours checking every inch of the outpost. All doors remained secured, all shutters intact. Even the north door, which had taken the brunt of the impacts, showed no new damage beyond the existing claw marks. It was as if the entire attack had been an elaborate hallucination, except we'd all experienced it. At 0700 hours, Robert spotted the approaching lights of the extraction helicopter on the horizon. We began final preparations immediately, packing essential equipment and securing sensitive materials according to protocol. I gathered my few personal items quickly, eager to leave this place behind. As I passed the medical bay, I paused to check on Jerry one last time. His restraints were still secure, but something was wrong. His chest didn't rise or fall with breath. "Carter," I called. "Mitchell's not breathing." Thomas and Robert arrived moments later. Thomas checked for a pulse, then shook his head. "Time of death approximately 0500 hours, he noted clinically, recording it in the medical log, consistent with previous cases. "Previous cases?" I asked. "Those who hear the voices never survive extraction day," Robert explained quietly. "It's like they hold on until they know we're leaving, then just let go." We covered Jerry's body and secured it for transport back to the mainland. I noticed his eyes had returned to normal in death, the unnatural blackness gone as if it had never been there. The helicopter landed at exactly 0800 hours. 4 soldiers disembarked, 3 men and 1 woman, all looking fresh and alert, unaware of what awaited them in this frozen hell. Thomas went out to meet them while Robert and I finished preparations. Through the window, I watched him speaking to their commanding officer, a tall woman with her hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her expression remained neutral as Thomas briefed her, giving no indication of what information he was sharing. When I stepped outside carrying my gear, the cold hit me with familiar brutality, but it felt different now. Just weather, not the malevolent presence I'd come to associate with the outpost's surroundings. The replacement commanding officer approached me as Thomas continued briefing her team. "Lieutenant Sandra Reeves," she said, extending her hand. "You're Patterson?" I nodded, reaching into my pocket for the laminated rule sheet Thomas had given me upon my arrival 7 days ago. It felt like years had passed since then. "You'll need this," I said, handing it to her. "Follow every rule, no exceptions." She accepted the sheet with a slight frown. "Command briefed us on standard protocols." "These aren't standard," I interrupted. "These are survival." Reeves studied my face for a moment, perhaps noting the new lines etched there, or the haunted look I couldn't hide. She nodded once and tucked the rule sheet into her pocket. The helicopter pilot signaled it was time to board. Thomas finished his briefing and joined us, his expression revealing nothing of what he had told the new team. "Outpost is transferred to your command, Lieutenant," he said formally. "May your watch be uneventful." As we boarded the helicopter, I noticed one of the new team members already heading toward the storage area where the blood was kept. They knew the ritual would need to be performed tonight. The rotors spun up to full speed, lifting us away from the outpost. As we gained altitude, I allowed myself to look down at the facility that had been my prison for the past week. The building looked smaller from above, more vulnerable, a tiny metal box against the vast white landscape. That's when I saw them. Standing in perfect stillness around the perimeter of the outpost were several figures. From our height, they appeared human-sized, but something about their proportions was subtly wrong. They stood motionless in the snow, faces tilted upward, watching our departure. I blinked, and they were gone. The snow lay empty and undisturbed around the outpost, as if they had never been there. Robert handed me a second copy of the rule sheet, identical to the one I'd just given Lieutenant Reeves. "Carter wanted you to have this," he said, "a reminder." I accepted it silently, folding it carefully and placing it in my inner pocket. I never spoke about my week at the outpost to anyone after that day. Not to the debriefing officers who questioned me about Travis's and Jerry's deaths. Not to the psychiatrist who evaluated me before clearing me for return to regular duty. Not even to Robert when our paths crossed months later at headquarters. But I kept that rule sheet with me always. A reminder not of what I'd seen, but of what remained unseen in the darkness beyond our fragile walls of civilization. A reminder that some boundaries exist for reasons beyond our understanding, and that sometimes survival depends not on fighting or fleeing, but on simply following the rules.